right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this USAID-hosted webinar on digging deeper into artisanal and small-scale mining, gender and women's economic empowerment. My name is Kim Thompson. I'm a natural resource governance and conflict advisor for USAID Washington, and I lead the agency's work on artisanal and small-scale mining. I'll be facilitating the webinar today, and we'll have the pleasure of introducing to you our excellent set of speakers. It's wonderful that we've seen such a strong interest in this topic. I'm seeing some people use that chat box to let us know who is on the line. So please keep doing that. We love to see who is listening in and participating in this webinar. First, before we get started, I would like to go over just a few housekeeping items. First of all, please note that today's webinar is being recorded. That means everything that you see and hear is going to be recorded, including anything that's entered into that chat box. That also means that after the event, the recording will be made available on our website land links. And we will also send a link out directly to the participants so that you can share it with your colleagues as well. Secondly, everyone should be able to hear today's webinar using your computer speakers or your personal headsets. But if you are experiencing any audio issues, please let us know in that chat box as well. Which brings me to the third point, which is I want to draw your attention to the chat box. The chat box, you should be able to see it in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And we do want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So please use that chat box throughout the webinar to submit questions to the speakers. And after the initial presentations, we'll have a virtual panel and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So please use that chat box. Today, we are building off of a webinar that we held in February on advancing artisanal mining, which took a look at USAID's work on artisanal and small-scale mining around the world and took a deep dive into the Oro Legal program in Colombia. If you missed that first webinar and are interested, a recording of it is available on USAID's Land Links website, and you can also find it in the Links and Resources section of your screen. So if you look at your screen, you should be able to see a Links and Resources section. We have also included some other key USAID resources in that section, including USAID's new issue brief on gender considerations in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. And during that first webinar that we held, we asked participants what they were most interested in learning about, and gender really stood out. And so that's really the purpose of today's webinar, is to take a closer look at the gender dimensions of artisanal and small-scale mining and opportunities for women's economic empowerment. And finally, just a quick note on definitions. When we are talking about artisanal and small-scale mining, we're really referring to mining that is not large-scale industrial mining. It's quite a varied sector, but it typically involves labor-intensive and low-cost mining that is minimally mechanized. So just a note on what we're talking about in terms of artisanal and small-scale mining, which we often refer to as ASM during today's webinar. So we have a great agenda today with some really wonderful panelists. This webinar is particularly exciting to me because we're going to have the chance not only to shed light on a largely invisible sector. The ASM sector has long operated in the shadows of informality, but we're also going to take a look at the most invisible piece of that ASM sector, which is the women who make up somewhere between 30 and 50% of the workforce. So for the agenda today, first we're going to hear opening remarks from USAID's Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator, Jeffrey Haney. And then we'll move on to a panel section where we'll briefly learn from 3 global experts and development practitioners about their pioneering work trying to address gender in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. And finally, we'll have a chance to have a Q&A discussion with the panelists. So if you have questions for the panelists at any time, please, once again, enter them into that chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So we're really lucky to have Jeffrey Haney, USAID's Acting Assistant Administrator for the Economic Growth, Education, and Environment Bureau with us today to share his thoughts on this topic and help us kick off the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Jeffrey.
Thanks so much, Kim, and thanks for your leadership on this issue. It's great to be here today to kick off this discussion, touching on 2 high-priority topics for USAID: artisanal and small-scale mining, and gender and women's economic empowerment. We've seen an increasing interest from USAID missions, the U.S. government interagency, and Congress to better understand and address the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. ASM is one of the most important non-farm rural livelihoods in developing countries. But as we all know, and many of us have seen firsthand, ASM's relationship to development is complex. In some contexts, artisanal mining leads to development gains, and in others, it is associated with conflict, corruption, instability, gender-based violence, and environmental damage. As you can see on the slide, USAID has invested approximately $140 million over the last 5 years in the ASM sector to help ensure that artisanal mining contributes to broader development outcomes. Meanwhile, the White House has elevated women's economic empowerment into a U.S. government priority initiative. The Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, also known as WGDP, has an ambitious goal of reaching 50 million women in the developing world by 2025. WGDP aims to enhance opportunities for women to participate meaningfully in the economy and advance both prosperity and national security. I am particularly excited about this webinar as it merges these 2 priority areas. It also coincides with the release of USAID's issue brief for ASM and gender that Kim mentioned you already have the link for. As Kim noted, the statistics at this nexus are compelling, with women making up 30 to 50% of the ASM workforce. In order to promote women's economic empowerment, it is imperative that we understand the unique barriers and opportunities facing women in the ASM sector. In many countries, women do not enjoy the same opportunities around access to, control over, and benefits from artisanal mining in their communities. The division of labor within the ASM supply chain is typically gendered, with women more often occupying jobs such as washing and crushing stone, and creating ancillary businesses such as selling food and goods around mining sites. While there is significant variation across countries, women tend to earn significantly less, often earning only 1/4 of what men earn in the ASM sector. Despite earning less, ASM still represents a critical source of income for women. COVID-19 has caused global ASM supply chains to collapse with devastating impacts for mining communities. For example, the global price of gold remains at near record high prices, but the price of gold at the local level has dropped by 50% in many places in Africa and Latin America due to the disruption in air travel and supply chains. Prices are slowly rebounding, but many ASM communities, including women and children, are suffering. I am pleased that USAID is able to host a panel discussion with some of the most esteemed and pioneering development professionals in the gender and ASM space. So thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. I'm also pleased to note that 2 of the organizations represented on today's panel, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, HHI, and the Alliance for Responsible Mining, ARM, are finalists for USAID's RISE Challenge. The RISE Challenge, or Resilient, Inclusive and Sustainable Environments Challenge, builds evidence on effective approaches that prevent and respond to gender-based violence in the environment sector. Both HHI and ARM proposed working with women artisanal miners to address both gender violence and reduce environmental degradation. Nearly 200 applicants from 49 countries entered the RISE Challenge. The fact that after the competitive review process, 2 out of 5 finalists are working in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector demonstrates the importance of addressing gender issues in this sector. I am also excited to announce that a second round of RISE Challenge will be announced later this year to fund a new set of grantees. You can visit competitionsfordev.org for the latest challenge announcements. In today's webinar, we will cover issues beyond gender-based violence. We will discuss the gender nature of the ASM sector more broadly, including both opportunities and challenges for women's economic empowerment. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Jeffrey. Those were excellent remarks that really help outline the connection between artisanal and small-scale mining and women's economic empowerment, both highlighting the importance of this sector on women's livelihoods as well as the challenges, which I think will set us up for a really great discussion. Also, thank you for noting the RISE Challenge and the opportunities from USAID to potentially program in this area. Next, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Really, we have a fabulous group of panelists today who really have been at the forefront of addressing gender disparities and women's economic empowerment in artisanal mining communities. First, we have Joanne Liebert, Executive Director of Impact, who will speak to us a bit about the findings of her research on the gender dimensions of mining across several countries in Africa. And then next we'll turn to Jocelyn Kelly, who's the Director of the Gender Rights and Resilience at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And she'll speak to us about addressing gender issues and promoting women's economic empowerment, specifically in artisanal mining communities in conflict-affected DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, we have Natalia Rocio Mendoza Baron. She's the gender coordinator for the Alliance for Responsible Mining. And she'll speak to us about her organization's work empowering women in the ASM sector in Latin America, particularly in Colombia and Peru. So we are extremely lucky to have these three panelists with us today. They collectively bring decades of experience researching the gender dimensions of artisanal and small-scale mining, as well as designing and implementing development solutions on the ground to address these challenges and to take advantage of some of the opportunities offered by the ASM sector. So just a final reminder to use that chat box at the bottom right-hand corner to submit any questions that you may have while you're listening to the speakers. We'll be cataloging the questions and sorting through them to try to answer them at the end of the discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to Joanne Liebert.
Thanks, Kim, and thank you to Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator Haney for those opening remarks, which I think really set the stage rather well and allows us to really dive more deeply into the subject matter. So my name is Joanne Liebert, and I'm with an NGO called Impact. We have existed for 34 years and work in natural resource management in areas where security and human rights are at risk. And primarily, we really want to ensure that communities are benefiting from their natural resources and empowered to make the decisions that affect their lives as relates to natural resources. Oops. So we have invested quite heavily in research since 2012, and so for the last 8 years, to better understand gender and ASM. And why? Because it was very clear from our work, decades of working in the diamond sector, supporting actors in the gold sector, tin, tungsten, coltan, and cobalt, that women were actively participating, but they were invisible. When we talked about ASM, it was talked about as a male issue, as if only men were working in the sector, and we knew that to be false. The other thing is we wanted to, let's say, trouble or explore how women were participating in the sector and the opportunities that lay before them. So it wasn't just about women as victims. We often heard about sexual and gender-based violence, and certainly, there are vulnerabilities in the sector, but we were convinced that there were opportunities as well. So that was really the goal of the research. What was particularly rich was the GROW research, and GROW stands for Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women. And we did that in partnership with the partners on the left and the funders on the right that are associated with that. And you can see, I don't have time to get into it, but you can see links to the briefs and the reports below, so you can, dive into it a bit later at your leisure. So why is ASM a gender issue? Well, because, as been said, women are very active in the sector. There are 41 million people who are directly engaged in ASM globally. That's more than the population of Canada. And when you multiply that by 5, you get a sense of the scale of the amount of people that are dependent on the sector. It's been said, and just earlier, I think Kim said that 40% of the workforce are women. But in our research, and the GROW research in particular, which took place in DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda, we saw that in some cases, depending on the commodity and depending on the mine site, up to 73% of women or the mine site workers were women. Now, all the typical, let's say, gender inequality dimensions of any sector apply here. And here we borrow heavily as an organization from the Women's Empowerment Assessment Index or framework that was developed by USAID, and we've adapted it to artisanal mining. So we look at assets, income, leadership, production, and time as a measurement from benchmark to today as to whether or not we're moving the dial on the SDGs and actually helping to support and realize women's economic empowerment. And women are essentially disenfranchised or suffer from inequality across all those dimensions. If you look just for income, for instance, we know that diggers are the ones that are most remunerated, yet that's the area where women tend to be left occupying as workers. And so 15% of women versus 62% of men in our research are diggers, which is, like I said, a higher paying job. Now, these gender inequalities underpin the vulnerabilities that face women. And these inequalities are further exacerbated in artisanal mining. ASM is artisanal small-scale mining, for those of you who may not be familiar with the acronym. And that's because it's poverty-driven, and it occurs largely in informality. So people are already operating in the shadows, and as been said, women in particular. It's also that the commodities and the minerals they're mining can be extremely lucrative. The price of gold, as was mentioned, is currently sky high. And so it's prone as a sector to predation, and especially in conflict-affected area, which creates or adds to the vulnerability of the sector. Now, I don't have time to get into the details of the graph, but this will be made available to you all after. But why is ASM important to women? It was mentioned that women consistently earn less, which is true, than men. However, as proven here through our study, women consistently earn more in mine sites than outside the mine sites. So artisanal mining, even if they earn less, is extremely important source of income for women, one that they're not readily, wanting to let go of because we think that it's an insecure work environment. They really depend on it, especially when we consider that 58% of women, I think it's actually higher than that, but in the areas we surveyed are the main contributors of income for their dependents. So this really underscores the importance of gender and formalization in ASM and any sort of responsible business conduct that runs along the supply chain right to the mine site. Now, so why not simply take women out of the sector? Well, first of all, I'd like to remind everybody that ASM is not going away. It's growing, and it's an increasingly important source of income for people. Our transition to the green economy is going to be increasingly dependent on mining, including artisanal mining, and we want to make sure people can do it safely and responsibly. So why not support alternative livelihoods? I mentioned why that income is so relatively important compared to other sources of income. So we can't cut that off. Women actually want to actively mine. They're individuals who want to make their own decisions, but they want to do so obviously in safe working conditions and have the choice whether or not to mine. To exclude them risks further marginalization. The first study we did between 2012 and 2014 was at a mine site where women were excluded. And what we found was that women were actually sneaking in at night, working through their male counterparts, or trying to negotiate and barter access through the mine site owner. And all of those things actually heightened the vulnerability of women in that area. And so we don't want to exclude them. We want to give them choice and better working conditions. And our data shows why women are so key to successful formalization and legalization and responsible business conduct, because women have proven in our data to be more loyal to legality, more loyal to traceability. They have slower rates of disengagement in times of insecurity, like right now during COVID and previously during Ebola. Women stay on selling legally, and they tend to be more committed to environmental stewardship. And these are really key to transforming the sector into a vector for development. And women are not only part of that, they're an important part of the solution that need to drive it. And yet, when we look at interventions like formalization and responsible business conduct, including responsible supply chains, we assume these to be neutral, but they can actually have negative impacts and further entrench gender inequality and make women even more insecure, especially in conflict areas. So formalization, for example, licenses go to miners, to diggers. So miners are qualified and defined as diggers, but all the women that don't work as diggers but work in the mine site then have trouble accessing licenses. They also obviously have other barriers like language and access or experience working with the bureaucracy, all those kind of barriers that are kind of typical by virtue of kind of structural disadvantages or by virtue of their absence and invisibility in a sector that's already invisible. Mining cooperatives tend to be male-dominated. Most decision-making structures tend to be male-dominated. It's very intimidating. They don't have the status or the capital to participate fully. So when we talk about formalization, we have to take those things into consideration. Responsible business conduct, I'm referring here to responsible supply chain. So knowing that something doesn't have, for example, the presence of structural forms of SGBV or child labor, et cetera, making sure a supply chain is clean. We all want to do that. And we have a project called Just Gold, which supports artisanal gold mining cooperatives to produce and trade responsibly. And some of the rings you see there are produced with that, with FDJCO based in Toronto. But when we first started out rolling that project, the data was telling us that yes, the price offered locally was better. Yay. The problem was that men were benefiting from that price, but not women. And so we were inadvertently, an organization committed to gender equality was inadvertently committing to gender inequality. And so we quickly worked to rectify that, and that's what I'm going to speak to now. But the point is really gender needs to be placed at the center of design, implementation, monitoring, and learning. And what we've learned from that, we're rolling out in a publication a tool on how to do that, funded by the Government of Canada, that we hope to finally publish in September after several years of testing it. So what we've done with this information has been, it's not a straight arrow. It's rather all very messy, but it does follow a certain kind of linear development that in and of itself is quite elucidating and quite illuminating. So the GROW research that I talked about in those 3 countries, DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda, we actually went back to the communities and shared the research results, and a lot of debate ensued. And so there was kind of like a participatory learning in action ownership of that research. And then they themselves, men and women, developed policy recommendations, and we then brought them to the capitals at the provincial and national level to share these policies with, or their recommendations with policymakers. And so that was very status raising. It was very important for consciousness raising. And it started a discussion amongst men and women, but also through a series of workshops targeting women only, around everyday inequalities, which they started to talk about as everyday violences, like they were living violence in different forms from day to day, on a day-to-day basis. So they were equating inequality with violence. I attended one of those workshops, and on the 3rd day, one of the women stood up and said, after 3 days of talking about inequality and the violences we live every day, I have learned that I can ask my son how his day at school was, and it's not just the father that can ask that. So that is the starting point. It was really quite, shocking to me to hear that, but that is the kind of everyday inequality and the starting point for everyone. The women themselves in those workshops then essentially identified themselves that the major, most important, urgent barrier was access to capital, because that too was linked to decision-making and status. And so we rolled out a project that's a credit and savings project, microstructures, a train-the-trainer approach, microstructures through the community where there was basic literacy, financial literacy, and in self-investment in savings and credit, business skills training, etc. And that spread like wildfire. They also had a solidarity fund that they invested in to help one another when urgencies or emergencies rose. And perhaps what was most important there, and is critical to know, at least in this context, Women were the ones that were trusted as the bankers. They held the money. Men didn't trust themselves. They only trusted women. So that, again, in addition to access to those skills and the credit and the savings or solidarity fund, really was a boost for economic resilience, but again, status enhancing, consciousness raising. And then they themselves formed a mining association of women called REAFECAM that helped them address another barrier, which was the isolation that they worked in, because men tend to work in teams, women tend to work isolated or through their counterparts. So REAFECAM was very important for that. They then went on to say, now we want training on how to address or how to mitigate local conflicts. And that, with the funding of the Swiss government together with the government of Canada, proved to be very important because on the one hand, it actually helped to mitigate conflict, local conflicts, and we have evidence to prove that. But they also actively identified victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and then set up a system to refer those women to the relevant services and accompanied the women throughout. And so the result of that is, again, in insecure times, like Ebola, like armed violence when it flares up, like COVID, instead of sexual violence peaking or armed violence increasing, we've actually seen it stable or actually decreasing anecdotally. So that is actually quite interesting and something we want to explore further as an organization with our partners. And finally, women's leadership and environmental stewardship, which is very much about inclusive decision-making and environmental leadership. So all of this has been funded by the Government of Canada with the exception of AFECAL, which is EPRM, as well as the tool. But it's been a process and a learning from supporting survival to solidarity to resilience to investment in peace and environmental considerations. Just to finish up, a few key metrics. So again, I won't go into the details, and this will be made available to you, but this is over a 1-year period where the gap essentially represents essentially division of labor. So we see at the bottom the different activities that take place in and around a mine site, with digger obviously being the most prized because it's the most remunerated. As a result of all the interventions and the work of the community, there was, let's say, a moment of dynamism midway where roles were changing, and now it's kind of settled where we see men and women more or less equal, doing the same things equally to the far right, or women even slightly higher than men in terms of mining at times, or in terms of digging at times. I made allusion to the 5 dimensions through that Women's Empowerment Index developed by USAID. It shows up in terms of results for us in terms of this dashboard over time, measured against a baseline. We collect information every 6 months. And we actually have a dashboard like this for every one of those bubbles on the left side, using a different measurement framework. But for gender equality, we rely on the Women's Economic Empowerment framework that we've developed for ASM. If I pull out that center kind of graph with the 5 dimensions, this is data collected on a 6-month cycle, and we should be adding, we have at least another 1.5 years of data that we need to add here, so it's a bit outdated, I'm sorry, but essentially it's on an upswing. And so what this says is, for example, the assets. Women, as a result of this work and as a result of the community's work that they've done, they now have access to pits. They now have access to equipment. They can now make decisions about it on their own. This is a lot of work that's gone on with the cooperative. The cooperative has rolled out an equal pricing policy, and now women are organized, self-organized to sell themselves. In terms of leadership, REAFECAM has been the biggest boost to that. But at the community level and in the cooperative, there's also a greater acknowledgement that women can benefit the sector and have a role to play, and so there's more space for them to engage as well in decision making. In terms of production, women can now decide where and when to mine. They have access to the more lucrative jobs, and they have now more and more registered as miners as well. So they're coming out and legalizing as well. Time is a screwy one. I don't want to get into too much, but that's because it's kind of been developed with leisure in mind, and women in artisanal mining communities don't have a lot of leisure, so we've developed proxy measurements around women's autonomy around decision making, and that has still to be recorded, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into that. My last slide is, what does this mean? What are we learning by doing? So all of this says that when efforts to support ASM, apologies for the spelling mistakes, are development-led and center around women's empowerment, we have shown and we can see that formalization and responsible supply chains, responsible business conduct are not only more lasting, but produce development dividends. We also see that communities are more resilient, and they tend to keep the worst forms of violence at bay, including SGBV, so essentially security dividends. So that is why it's important for gender and women's empowerment to be at the center of responsible business conduct and formalization. And I encourage you to take a look at the blog we posted last week that presents some of the data and preliminary analysis to support those statements. So thank you. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Joanne. And for anyone that has been working, as a lot of people on the line are working in the sector for a long time, will be well aware that there is a dearth of rigorous data on the ASM sector in general, and even more so when we're looking at ASM and gender. And so the research that Joanne has done is really going a long way towards filling this gap. So I hope you're paying attention. There's a lot of great data in there. A couple of quick messages that I certainly will personally take away from the presentation is that efforts to promote formalization in the sector, in the ASM sector, that don't address gender issues sort of head on can inadvertently marginalize women even further. And secondly, the second point that I'll take away is that research shows that women are more loyal towards efforts to promote responsible sourcing, particularly in times of upheaval like we're seeing right now with COVID-19. So thank you so much, Joanne. Now I would like to move on to Jocelyn Kelly, the Director of Gender Rights and Resilience from Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And she's going to speak to us about addressing gender issues and women's economic empowerment in artisanal mining communities in Democratic Republic of Congo. And with that, I will hand it over to Jocelyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you, Joanne, for that incredible presentation. So good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Jocelyn Kelly. I'm the Director of the Program on Gender Rights and Resilience at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And we're a multidisciplinary research group located at Harvard University dedicated to bringing evidence and education to the practice of relieving human suffering in crisis. So I'm really excited to be here to share some of the results of our long-term research on artisanal and small-scale mining, gender, and conflict. And from there, I'll be moving on to tell you about a new project we have titled Resourceful Empowerment, Elevating Women's Voices for Human and Environmental Protection in Congolese Small-Scale Mining Sites. So for this project, I'm privileged to be part of a wider consortium of grassroots women's organizations based in Eastern DRC. And so when I speak about that project, I'm speaking on behalf of all of these incredible individuals noted on this slide. So I'd like to start by presenting some of our findings from the long-term research in the conflict-affected region of Eastern DRC that we've done. And in many ways, this context represents many of the challenges that were highlighted by Deputy Assistant Administrator Haney, and is an example of the challenges and opportunities that can exist in this complex informal sector in the face of ongoing instability. So DRC has been embroiled in protracted armed conflict since the late 1990s, and during this time, artisanal and small-scale mining emerged as a powerful economic driver. The protracted conflict in DRC has eroded the agricultural industry through displacement, mass looting, insecurity, and market deterioration. And as farming collapsed and became less viable as a sustainable source of income, mining gained ascendancy, providing Congolese communities with a source of much-needed income that was more sustainable amidst an ongoing war. So the numbers you see here really speak to the importance of this sector in the economy and mirrors the global numbers. Roughly 500,000 people are directly engaged in ASM in the country, and many, many more provide support through additional roles. A variety of minerals are mined in DRC, gold, cassiterite, tantalite, wolframite, and precious gemstones among them. And in a country racked by decades of war, ASM provides revenue to 16% of the population in DRC. So when HHI started engaging with mining communities over a decade ago, there was a dearth of research specifically into the gender dimensions of artisanal and small-scale mining as a means to provide economic security for both men and women. And I think that's something that Joanne really highlighted. And of course, since that time, we've come a really long way. There was often insufficient analysis of the real and potential threats to women's human rights in the artisanal mining sector, especially in DRC. But ongoing work really highlighted the opportunities for women-led action and self-organization. So I'll very briefly present kind of a mishmash of results from 10 years of qualitative and quantitative research on different topics related to ASM and DRC. And then I'm very excited to tell you about the project that I mentioned at the beginning. So what did we find after undertaking years of engagement with local communities? We found there was enormous discrimination in the access to employment. So acquiring work was dictated by one's ability to pay for access to the mines or to buy tools that were a barrier to entry to much of the more profitable labor. Women and other vulnerable populations were relegated to marginal support roles that were more physically taxing and much more lower paying than men. There were severe issues with safety and working conditions and little knowledge about health and poor access to health services. People summarized health problems into three broad categories: poor labor conditions, poor structure of mining tunnels, and public health problems such as poor hygiene and high levels of infectious disease. And this is from before the time of COVID. So you can imagine the profound consequences of the current pandemic on communities that are already in crowded working conditions with little ability to wash hands or have running water or socially distance. So there's a really interesting initiative, and I think many people on the call now, both presenters and participants, might be aware of this. The DELVE initiative in collaboration with the World Bank is trying to do quick real-time data collection to get a snapshot of how mining communities are affected using remote data collection techniques. And so it's really to highlight how some of these really invisible communities are dealing with the pandemic in really challenging conditions. This is, as we have noted, an environment also rife with very high levels of exploitation and abuse, especially for women and vulnerable populations. So while women are vital actors in mining communities and fill many roles, they're also among the most vulnerable to sexual and economic predation. Rape was described as commonplace in mining towns. Many women are forced to engage in transactional sex out of desperation. And these sex work populations were often migratory, which meant that they had no social or financial support as they were moving from mining site to mining site. Some of our quantitative work really brought out many of the women's issues and kind of put a number to what were very invisible or underlying problems. Only 17% of women in mining towns thought that they had the right to be there. And if you think about the implications for women's ability to speak up and to advocate for themselves, obviously the stat has a lot to do with their sense that they are disenfranchised or possibly don't belong there, so they need to remain a hidden population. 1 in 7 women were forced to trade sex for simply access to work in the mines, which is a mind-boggling number. Fully 1 in 3 women stated they had experienced sexual harassment in the mines. And interestingly, we also found that the most common perpetrators of abuse were local officials or local miners rather than armed groups. And so armed groups certainly are an issue, absolutely. But the fact that the majority of perpetrators for many forms of abuse were indeed local actors suggests that programming that is undertaken to change attitudes, behaviors in mining communities can have a big impact. And perhaps one of my biggest takeaways from this was that only 1 in 4 women had ever discussed abuse or harassment with other women. Yet, women's right to work in mining towns is enshrined in the Congolese law and in the National Mining Code. And women stated themselves that self-organizing and connecting with other women was one of the best ways to address the problems that they faced. So we have clear opportunities to address some of these identified gaps and challenges which are really pressing in these sites. Women had a clear, and men that we surveyed had kind of a clear mandate. They said, we'd like to improve the technical assistance related to safety and health in artisanal mining communities, and in the time of COVID, that can be even more important. They would like to engage in improving education around the mining code and the rights enshrined in that code, to strengthen the capacity of local associations to advocate for their own rights, and to promote grassroots and inclusive economic cooperatives. And so what we heard from Joanne was a lot of times the new systems that have been set up often really favor men. And what we've seen, because HHI is actually doing a project to look also at some of that responsible sourcing and due diligence programming, is that when programming is gender blind, it can often actually be gender negative. So what we found is a lot of the due diligence mechanisms that had been set up really didn't take women particularly into account. And that resulted in women being disenfranchised from formal structures that could have actually empowered them or helped them. So as a researcher, there's no greater privilege than to give recommendations for action that could be taken and then to actually be a part of a team that is following through on those recommendations. So I'd love to tell you briefly about an effort that we're launching called, I'm getting ahead of myself.
And Jocelyn, sorry, I'm going to just cut in just for a second. Can you wrap up fairly quickly?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
And the goal of this project is to create an evidence-based, scalable, and replicable curriculum leveraging a women-led consortium to empower women in mining towns and to advocate for better environmental practices, as well as improved human rights. And the last note that I'll say is in the curriculum, we're actually doing a test to look at 2 different approaches with a randomized set of groups. So in the first group, we'll take a classic approach to teaching many of the topics that we talked about before. And in the second group, we'll look at the same topics, but with a really strong emphasis on the connections between people and among people and the environment. And the hypothesis is that the interconnectedness curriculum might actually be more effective than classic curriculums in helping improve safety and human rights in mining towns. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting work. Again, very evidence-based, based on I think you said 10 years of research. Thank you for that presentation. I think that your holistic approach to working with women's organizations to empower women, improve human rights and environmental practices altogether is particularly compelling. And I really look forward to learning about the results from your research about whether emphasizing that sort of interconnectedness is a more effective approach to training. So I really look forward to that. Thank you for your presentation. And now I'd like to hand it over to our final panelist, Natalia Rocia Mendoza-Beron, the gender coordinator for the Alliance for Responsible Mining. And she'll speak with us about ARM's work towards empowering women in the ASM sector in Colombia and Peru. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Kim, for the introduction, and thank you for the remark of the beginning of the conference. Good morning. My name is Natalia Rocio Mendoza-Baron. I represent Alliance for Responsible Mining. We are an NGO based in Colombia, and today I would like to present some experience, and I'm going to talk about gender equity in the artisanal and small-scale mining. So, to start, I would like to say that Alliance for Responsible Mining has worked with gender equity in different contexts. One of them is the artisanal mining sector, where you can find more women, at least in Latin America, in our experience in Peru and Colombia, and you can see more vulnerabilities that affect them. You can see in the pictures the women that made artisanal activities. The first group of these women worked in artisanal mining sectors are the panners, who look for liberated gold in alluvial deposits like streams and riverbanks, and they use manual methods. That's why they use the pan. And another important group in the artisanal mining are the mineral selectors, who are mostly women, and they search for minerals that can still have some value in the areas where mines deposit their sterile rock that is not considered economically viable for the mines. And in the other group of women or mine where Alliance for Responsible Mining work with is the smaller scale mining cooperatives and companies. They have a more structured mining operation, and in this case, the women normally work, but they are a minority in this sector because it's mostly dominated by men. And in here, the problematic that they face are different, and the type of discrimination are also different. And for example, they are only delegated to do support tasks. In this point, it's very important for me to point out that Alliance for Responsible Mining is a standard-setting organization, and we propose to the miners a progressive improvement approach to achieve the sustainability that they need. And we also designed and we gave technical assistance to the two standards that we develop and that we manage. The first one is the craft standard that we use it for miners starting their formalization process, and the fair mine standard that we use it for more advanced mining organization. The gender approach is integrated and is involved in these two standards, and with this and how we implement and integrate the due diligence that is required, we achieve the gender equity in the mining sector. We also made this study called Gender Gap in Mining, Colombian ASM from a Gender Perspective, thanks to Somos Tesoro project led by PAC and financed by U.S. Department of Labor. With this study, we identify all the gender gaps and barriers that women of mining sector have to overcome, all the different kind of stereotypes of discrimination that they have to face. But in this study, we also study the discrimination and the mining in 3 regions in Colombia, in coal mine and in gold mines. So the discrimination are different in all the regions. And Alliance for Responsible Mining also has worked with women in ASM in Colombia and Peru, and that's why we are going to talk about some of a gender strategy. The first one is the economic empowerment, political empowerment, and visibility, and the last one is achieving a life free of gender violence. So I'm going to start with the economic empowerment. So we find out that the informal sector have a great opportunity to improve thanks to the connection with formal markets for artisanal miners. In this part, I would like to show up that thanks to the funding of EPRM and our craft code, we were able to make a pilot for improve the work conditions and the incomes of a group of women in Cauca that are mineral selectors, and thanks to these actions, they have access for the formal market, and they really notice the increase of their income. And we also find out that these activities, these artisanal activities, aren't a full-time job, and women also need another activities or develop another skills to achieve another increase of incomes. That's why we made a diversification of income source. We have 2 examples because we work with 2 permine mines in Peru. The first one is in Mandesa, and thanks to the initiative funded with Fair Mine Premium, they set up a tailored clothing, and now they mineral selectors make uniforms for miners. And the second example is the Secomit, also a fair mine in Peru, and thanks to the U.S. Department of State and Colorado School of Mines, now the mineral selectors have the opportunity to develop new skills and do jewelry workshops. We also, thanks to the project Somos Tesoro, led by Impact, develop another skills as fish ponds and bakery. Now, it's important to talk more about the second strategy that we implement, that is political empowerment and visibility. For Alliance for Responsible Mining, it's very important to strengthen female leaderships, so the miner women are able to raise their voice, talk about gender equity issues, and we promote the participation of women associations in local and national space, and promote exchange of experience so they can share experience, get inspired of another exercise in another part of the world. And we also make a communication strategy to raise awareness about all these gender topics. And we also give the importance to include the gender policy in mind, and we give the technical assistance that is needed to do this. And we have a very great experience working with new masculinities, that we made some workshops with male coal miners in Boyacá, Colombia. And finally, our last strategy is achieving a life free of gender violence. It's important to say that we are a RISE finalist, and next month we are going to start a new adventure with MIT Lab. This process is financed by USAID, and we are going to address gender violence in 4 municipalities in Antioquia, Colombia. And finally, I would like to thank you all for this opportunity, for this space, and I would like to invite you all to visit our website to find more about Alliance for Responsible Mining and get to know more about our fundraising campaign that we are leading to support women miners in Latin America. And please join our social media platforms. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Natalia Mendoza-Baron. I specifically liked that you really went into some of the specific tools that the Alliance for Responsible Mining uses, from the gender assessment, the really in-depth gender assessments, to using due diligence tools such as Fairmind and Craft, and underscoring the importance of sort of pairing the economic empowerment with political empowerment. So thank you so much. We are running a little bit behind, and so what we're going to do is we're going to invite the panelists that are able to stay, and any of the participants that are able to stay, to stay with us, and we can answer some questions. We will also we've got a lot of great questions in that chat box, so thank you for entering those. We will also select some of the questions to answer in written form, and we'll send those out as well for ones that we're not able to get to today. But I did want to quickly at least get to a few questions, and I'd like to start with Joanne. And there's a question that is asking, it says, is it difficult to integrate illegal or informal ASM within an occupational and labor policies based framework, since it's a social phenomenon rather than a business project, such as other legal mining activities? And then would it be possible to account for such particularism by national policies? And so I think what it's getting at is really asking about how to address artisanal and small-scale mining within national policies.
Right. Okay. I'm going to try to answer it coherently and subject to my interpretation of that question. So I think the answer, yes, is doable to address this sector in national policy. I think the trend, I think there's been a lot of dust up around regulatory and policy reform for ASM and the mining sector globally, especially maybe in Africa. I think the challenge is that governments have tended to address the issue in an ad hoc sort of way, and so it's in the mining ministry, but of course it cuts across many multiple ministries, labor, gender, family, etc. And so what is rarely apparent is a national strategy. They go right to specific policies within the Ministry of Mines that might not have the right tools or the right vision. And a lot of countries actually focus on large-scale mining and privilege that in policies and practices. And instead, ASM is more laws and decrees about things that should not be done. So it's more about pushing aside, or here is a standard or an expectation, or the law says this, do not do that. And so it's that sort of enforcement approach that's kind of set in the Ministry of Mines, rather than an overall strategy that is more a development-based approach, quite frankly, that would support the sector to become more formalized and contribute to development and security. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there's a couple, I can think of a couple of countries that do have a national strategy, but by and large it's very ad hoc and more of an enforcement and exclusion approach rather than one of seeing this as a real vector for development and supporting it that way.
Wonderful, thank you. And moving on to the next question, it's going to be for Jocelyn. And the question is, to what extent do women's lack of awareness about their rights play as a factor in being discriminated against in the field or being misused? Have there been projects in raising awareness among women about their legal and natural rights and to train women on reporting mechanisms, enabling them to report cases of abuse to local authorities? So it's a question about reporting mechanisms as well as awareness raising of rights for women.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. Thank you so much. So basically, I think the lack of awareness plays an enormous role in women feeling like if they don't belong in mining towns, they somehow have to bribe their way in, and that can be through sex or money or illegal taxation, etc. So you can imagine if you always feel marginalized, you're always going to be kind of walking on eggshells and feeling like you don't have the opportunity to advocate for the rights that you are actually entitled to. So there have certainly been efforts and really wonderful, thoughtful efforts done by groups to raise women's awareness. And, kind of speaking to some of the other issues that we talked about, to raise awareness among both women and men. So that's an equal understanding, I think, is extraordinarily important. And the reporting question is so thoughtful. So basically what we found is that if you think you're not supposed to be there, you have no opportunity to report. But in some of these responsible mineral sourcing sites, or we call them sometimes due diligence sites, they do set up reporting mechanisms for people to report abuses or misuse of the system. However, as we noted before, often those were set up in a pretty gender insensitive way. And so what we see is there's leadership councils that are full of men, and then the reporting mechanism is to come to a man and talk about an abuse that you faced. So those reporting mechanisms can be really detrimental for women being able to volunteer very sensitive information about, for instance, sexual abuse. In some towns, however, we see women self-organizing with male champions to create much more gender-sensitive reporting mechanisms spontaneously, where women can report to women. That woman will anonymize the report and then take it to a male leader. But that's not formalized. That's something that the communities figured out themselves. So there's a lot of room for improvement.
Wonderful, thank you. And the next question is going to Natalia, and the question is that the Alliance for Responsible Mining has promoted formalization in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector around the world, including Colombia and Peru, following best practices. But this question is zooming into ARM's efforts to promote cultural transformation. Can you talk a little bit more about what specific efforts at the local and community levels and what specific efforts at the national level have been most effective in achieving cultural transformation?
Yes, thank you, Kim. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I think we have a very interesting question. I will like to divide the answer in three parts. The first one is from our experience as an international organization or an NGO. Alliance for Responsible Mining has made a very big effort to review our management system to ensure that all the policies, process, and elements that we made are orientated to get the real materialization of the equality. That means to really implement the gender mainstreaming strategy that we need when we talk about gender issues. This is a beginning road. This strategy is really new. We're trying to improve our process to do this in a good way and to really make that impact in the mining sector, because this has to continue every day. This is not a final issue. And the second one, I would like to include highlight all the gender approach that we have made until this moment in our two standards, the craft and the fair mining standard. I think this is a good example to how to make or try to make in a good way the gender mainstreaming, and we provide a framework to influence organizational process of artisanal and small-scale mining, and we promote cultural change to improve gender equity and better prevent social and economic violence in mines. For example, the process of elaborating the gender equity policy in mines, we include women, and we include them in the fair mine premium, so they can contribute to a progressive evolution of mentality. And the third part is the work in the communities to raise awareness. We would like to share, for example, as part of Somos Tesoro project, we have carried out some workshops of alternative masculinities with male coal miners, as I said in the presentation, in a very conservative region in Colombia, which is Boyacá, and it was a very enriching experience and another interesting example of changing the mentality. We observed this situation when we work with women mineral sectors in Cauca. When we started the project, they were completely invisible in their communities, and they feel shameful of what they do. But when we start the process and we help to build the association, we see that they were empowered, and now they have another view of the activity. They are proud of the work that they have done, and we also change or help to change the mentality, changing the name. For example, in Colombia, they didn't call them before mineral selectors. They call them chatarreras. That is a very terrible name. Is like the garbage collector, and they were offended when they used this name. So this is some examples of how to achieve cultural transformation that is needed.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I think we have time for two more questions. So the next question is going to go back to Joanne. And it's really a question commenting on cooperatives versus working with cooperatives versus working with change agents. So the question is, the requirements to form a cooperative are so complicated, bureaucratic, and expensive that they don't encourage formalization for women. Working with men or women who are change agents or champions could be a good starting point, and then looking at policy reform. So I'm wondering, Joanne, if you have any comments about that.
I would agree with that, working with men and women as change agents, all the while working on policy reform with them, obviously. It depends on the context. I mean, in some contexts in West Africa where we work, the cooperatives there, there's more openness to having a more inclusive approach in terms of how the cooperative is managed and membership and that sort of thing. And then we've worked in other situations where essentially cooperatives are nothing but elite capture and actually predatory, essentially using miners as slave laborers. And so you don't have a chance in reforming that, or very little, or it's really a long game that you're playing and you're hoping for the best, because, you know, it's one thing to try to reform a cooperative. It's quite something else to reform a whole, web of power at a local level. So one of the things we've started to doing instead is, for lack of a better term, we're working with pre-cooperatives, even pre-cooperatives. So the challenge is ASM are not neatly organized. They're structured organically, but sometimes cooperatives and the cooperative model is imposed, and or we're working with cooperatives whose power is already so deeply entrenched you can't change it. The vast majority of artisanal miners are not in cooperatives, and so we are aiming to work with those and adapt to their reality, and invest in change agents who them and their colleagues can eventually create associations or cooperatives or structures that reflect their needs. And so that's a roundabout, answer, but it depends on the context and depends with which communities one works with. But there are different possible entry points.
Great, thank you. And one more question for Jocelyn. I'm trying to find it now. Says the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has invested heavily in the DRC, a conflict-affected country with high rates of gender-based violence. And under certain conditions, empowering women in country contexts like the DRC can inadvertently increase conflict and gender-based violence. So do you have any specific advice that you can share with development practitioners that want to promote women's economic empowerment in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector in a context similar to the DRC?
Yeah, it's an amazing question, and that can really be a pitfall of women's empowerment, that by focusing in on this one population that is not traditionally hyper-empowered, you can really create some fractures within the community or feelings of resentment. So there's definitely a number of best practices that HHI and many of the other presenters, I think, embrace, which is holistic programming, where you get buy-in through community leadership boards at the beginning in the design of the project, and really identify pitfalls or areas where you could be unintentionally exacerbating resentment within the community, particularly resentment between women and men, maybe before it can even begin to develop. We've also really started to explore a little bit more programming that doesn't necessarily single out gender-based violence as a single form of abuse, but looks at understanding kind of the panoply or the landscape of abuses that communities face. And almost inevitably, as part of that, gender-based violence arises. And men are often hyper-aware that this is an extraordinarily big challenge for women. But when you use that as a starting point, particularly if you're seen as an outside actor, it can really raise resentment. So the idea of having community leadership from the beginning and taking a more holistic approach, one of the projects we're looking at now in collaboration with USAID is supporting community-based trauma healing efforts, and that acknowledges the kind of entirety of trauma or challenges that community face. And gender-based violence is a big part of that, but the community decides how we talk about that, and it's a very collaborative approach. And I think those kinds of approaches, rather than being prescriptive but much more listening oriented, can get you off to a better start. And I know that both Joanne and Natalia are experts in this as well, so I'll turn over to them to complete.
Okay, well, I think we need to start wrapping up, so I think we'll have one final question that really is just going to go out to anyone who would like to answer it. We got an excellent question about land rights issues. So the question is, how have land rights intersected with your work on women's empowerment, both in terms of disputes or other factors in mining sites and towns, and as a metric for empowerment and socioeconomic progress for women? So it's really a question about women's land rights and artisanal and small-scale mining. And I don't have any one of the panelists specifically in mind, so if you would like to jump in, please do.
I guess I'll jump in with maybe a non-response. It depends. I think, again, it depends on the context in which you're working. Discussing land rights in a place like the DRC is a very thorny thing, and has multiple layers of rights upon multiple layers of rights, and local actors don't even know who owns what or who controls what. And so in that context, you're pretty far removed from, unfortunately, looking at gender and land rights, at least in a near term. So it would be, again, a long-term game. But obviously, everything that land rights underpins all of this, right? And ASM, people just don't have places to mine. Title is a much more realistic one in those contexts, and supporting women to have access to title or to be granted customary access to land is a much more accessible path in the near term, maybe eventually with a view to address the land rights issue. But I think that requires, again, a whole bunch of stakeholders to get together and to be on the same page, which is not always easy in that situation. But again, it depends on the context. I think there'd be other situations that are more ripe for the issue of gender and land rights. Maybe others have information.
Great, thank you for that. And I'll just note that the USAID does support a program called Artisanal Mining and Property Rights that specifically does try to address, try to formalize some rights over resources for the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, of course, including women. And so some of that information can be found on our website. It is, I think Joanne's comments were right on, that it is a difficult and it's a difficult space to work in, and the progress is often slow, and sometimes progress can be made in sort of customary tenure arrangements before more formal arrangements. But anyway, there is more information on that from our Artisanal Mining and Property Rights program that you can find on our website. I wanted to thank you, everyone that has joined the webinar and those that have stayed for this extended discussion. Thank you for joining us. You can find more information on, again, USAID's website land links. And before you go, I would ask that you take a minute or two to answer, I believe it's 4 questions about the webinar. We do look at these and appreciate it. And again, we will be looking at some of the questions that we were not able to answer and try to write some of those up. And finally, we will be sending out a link to everyone so that you can share it with your colleagues. Again, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much to all the presenters today. We really appreciate it.